Can a 6-year-old child really inspire a worldwide health movement? What would you do if you were a 6-year-old child, abandoned in the burning desert, with no one around, no one knowing where you are, and no one looking for you? Would you cry until your voice gave out in despair? Or would you wait for a nameless miracle from the skies? Lucas chose neither. Because he didn't even understand why this was happening to him. All he knew was the pain in his body was getting worse. Every time he had a fever, his skin broke out in red, fiery rashes. His limbs curled up in agony. He fainted often or lay there gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, while his mother, Mariana, sat by his bedside through the night. No doctor could pinpoint what was wrong with him. They guessed. They ran tests. They prescribed expensive medications without certainty. And those prescriptions quickly drained the family's finances already broken long before Lucas was old enough to go to school. Lucas's biological father died in an accident, leaving him and his mother to fend for themselves in an unstable world. Like many single mothers, Mariana remarried. Her new husband was named Carlos, a man who seemed kind, soft-spoken, but cold as stone on the inside. In the beginning, Carlos acted caring. He took Lucas to doctor appointments, bought him small gifts, and sat at the dinner table. But as the illness worsened, as Lucas's cries disturbed the nights, and as the medical bills soared each month, Carlos's gaze changed. There was no compassion anymore, only resentment, weariness, and eventually, hatred. Lucas noticed. At just 6, he was sensitive enough to feel when someone was faking a smile. He said nothing to his mother. He only grew quieter, more withdrawn. His only friend was a large German shepherd named Thor. Thor couldn't speak. But he could listen. Whenever Lucas writhed in pain, Thor would lie close, pressing his warm body against the boy's side and gently licking the tears off his cheeks. Thor never left him, not even for one night. But that morning, everything changed. Carlos entered Lucas's room with an unusually friendly smile, too warm to be real. "Come on, kiddo. Just you and me today. Let's go for a little trip." Lucas was surprised but happy. It was the first time Carlos had ever asked to go anywhere with him. He thought, maybe things are getting better. Maybe he's starting to love me. He smiled a weak smile, but filled with hope. His mother was surprised too. But she didn't protest. Maybe she was too exhausted. Maybe she just needed a moment to breathe from a life with no way out. Thor tried to follow them, but Carlos shoved him away. "Not you. Not today." The dog growled softly, eyes full of suspicion, watching the car disappear into the dust. Inside the vehicle, Lucas stared out the window. Trees and buildings slipped by, then faded into barren land. The road turned rough, the trees disappeared, and the ground turned to dry, cracked earth. He started to feel uneasy, but he didn't ask questions. Maybe because he still wanted to believe in something good. Until the car stopped in the middle of nowhere, just sand, rocks, and a burning sky. No trees. No sounds. Just the howling wind. Carlos told him to get out. He handed Lucas a small backpack with a bottle of water and a few snacks. Then he turned his back and started walking away. Lucas blinked. "Uncle, where are we? Aren't we going back?" Carlos stood still, not angry, but bitter and hopeless. "I can't take it anymore. Your mom's lost sleep, spent everything. I did too. You're not part of this life anymore." Those words hit the child like a mountain falling on his chest. He didn't fully understand them, but he felt them. He was being left behind. He burst into tears. Screamed. Chased the car as it sped away, dust covering his tiny, trembling body. He ran. Then fell. The hot sand burned his skin. No one heard him. No one saw him. Alone. That was the only word left in the desert and in the heart of a 6-year-old, discarded like broken trash. The only miracle now would have to come from somewhere unimaginable. Have you ever been abandoned in a place with no signs of life, under a sky that burns every inch of hope, with ground so hot it could roast flesh? Lucas was left there. At just 6 years old. As the dust from Carlos's car faded, the cruel truth hit like a slap to the soul: he had been left to die. Lucas stood frozen in the desert's terrifying silence, his tears mixing with sweat on his scorched face. He clutched the tiny backpack like it was the last thread tying him to the human world. Inside, a half-liter of water, 2 foil-wrapped sandwiches, and a granola bar. That's all. He stood still for a long time, shocked. But then, something primal kicked in: survival. He looked around. Nothing. No power lines. No engine sounds. Just wind. And sun. The sand hissed underfoot, burning like needles. "Mom," he whispered. The word evaporated into the air. No reply. Lucas decided to walk the way the car had gone. Maybe he'd find someone. A road. A gas station. But after just a few steps, his legs trembled. The illness clung to him like a shadow: fatigue, joint pain, dizziness. The world began to spin. He needed shade. Now. Or he would collapse and never wake again. After dragging his feet for what felt like hours, he saw a low outcrop of rocks. Not a cave. Not a shelter. But enough for a sliver of shadow. Lucas crawled like a wounded animal. He pressed his back against the cool stone and opened the water bottle. Just one sip. He knew this was all he had. "Is anyone there?" he cried, hoarse. Silence. The wind whistled across the sand, mocking him. He shut his eyes, holding back tears. Not because he was brave, but because crying would waste water, the one thing more precious than gold. Time passed, measured not by a clock, but by suffering. The sun faded. But the heat remained. Lucas fell asleep without knowing. When he awoke, the fever had returned. The red rashes reappeared. Pain spread from shoulders to wrists to knees. He gasped, clutched his backpack like it was his mother, and braced for death. But then, a sound. Faint. Far. Not wind. Not a hallucination. A bark. Lucas snapped his eyes open. Sat up, pain flaring through his joints. But he had heard it. Again. Closer. He turned, tried to stand, dizzy. Starving. Dehydrated. And then a familiar black blur darted across the sand. Tongue out. Body dusty. Eyes shining. Thor. Lucas screamed. The massive dog barreled into him, growling joyfully, licking his face furiously. It howled as if it, too, wanted to cry. No one can explain how a dog tracked a child through dozens of kilometers of desert. Unless you believe in instinct. Or miracles. Lucas hugged Thor tightly, sobbing. This time, he didn't hold back. He was no longer alone. "Thank you, for coming for me," he whispered. And Thor understood, licking his cheek, eyes misty. Night fell. Unlike the blazing day, desert nights are bone-chilling. Lucas curled up against Thor's warm body. They shared the little food. Sipped the water. In the vast darkness, no lights, no car horns, just two souls breathing together. They didn't know if they'd survive tomorrow. But they knew they weren't alone anymore. And that was the first spark of hope. Have you ever shivered from cold in the middle of a desert? A place that burns by day, but by night, feels like it's trying to drag your soul into a pit of frost. Lucas had lived through it, not just once, but during the first night of life and death. The 6-year-old clung to Thor, soaking in the warmth of the dog's thick fur and steady breathing, the only lullaby keeping him from breaking apart. The wind howled through the cracks between rocks, carrying a bone-deep chill that sank into his flesh. "Thor. I'm scared," Lucas whispered, his lips beginning to turn blue. Thor couldn't answer, but he gently licked the boy's cheek. Just one lick, but to Lucas, it felt like a mother's embrace, the one he longed so desperately to feel again. Those two small beings curled together like a flickering flame in a sea of darkness. They didn't need anyone to understand. They only needed each other. By dawn, Lucas felt every bone in his body ache as if twisted through the night. His eyes stung. His throat burned like fire. But he was alive, and that was enough. He shared another sip of water with Thor. Less than half a bottle left. Lucas knew, if they didn't find someone today, everything would end. "Thor. I don't want to die here," his voice cracked, like shattered glass. Thor seemed to understand. He stood up, circling Lucas, nose pressed to the ground, sniffing intensely. Then suddenly, he stopped. His ears perked up. He stared in one direction. "What is it?" Lucas looked up. Thor growled low, then bolted forward like an arrow. "Wait. Thor." Lucas staggered to his feet, struggling to follow. But Thor didn't go far. He stopped atop a sandy ridge, turning to bark softly, as if to say, "Come here." Lucas climbed after him, and when he reached the top, he froze in disbelief. Below the dune, hidden behind a large rock, was a dusty jeep, its door ajar. And beside it, lay a man, motionless on the blazing sand. Lucas held his breath. His first instinct was fear. What if the man was dangerous? Or already dead? But a child's intuition isn't clouded by the same suspicion adults carry. Lucas only knew one thing: there's someone here. And that someone might mean life, or might need saving. He crawled down, kneeling beside the man. The man's skin was red and sunburned, lips cracked, limbs limp. But what shocked Lucas was that his skin showed the same red blotches Lucas had when he was sick. Lucas held his hand near the man's nose, a faint breath escaped. "He's like me," Lucas whispered. Thor came close, sniffed the man, then looked at Lucas. No barking. No growling. Just waiting. Lucas understood. This was a choice. Help him, or walk away. He opened the backpack. Half a bottle of water. Not enough for a whole day. But he didn't hesitate. He tilted the man's head and gently let drops of water fall onto his cracked lips. At first, no reaction. Then, a flutter of the eyelids. A breath, like a sigh from someone dragged back from death. "Mister, can you hear me?" Lucas shook his arm. The man slowly opened his eyes, cloudy and unfocused. A faint groan. "Water." Lucas gave him more, slowly, drop by drop, like reviving each blood vessel. Within minutes, the man's breathing steadied. His eyes found focus, First on Lucas, then on Thor. "Who are you?" he rasped. "I'm Lucas. And this is Thor." The man tried to move but winced in pain. "My name is Eduardo. I thought I was going to die." Lucas gripped his hand. "No, sir. I thought I was going to die too. But Thor found me. And now I found you. We have to live." Eduardo gave a weak smile, part sorrow, part gratitude. In that moment, a discarded child and a desperate man were no longer strangers. They had become companions in a battle for survival. If fate truly exists, why would it lead two complete strangers, an abandoned child and a dying man, to meet in the middle of nowhere? Was it because they shared the same pain, the same mysterious illness that no one could name? Lucas didn't have time to ponder life's big questions. All he knew was that Eduardo was too weak to survive much longer, and if he couldn't get him into that jeep, they would both die. "We need to get back to the car," Eduardo gasped. "There's medicine inside, it might keep me alive a bit longer." Lucas nodded, a fierce determination in his young eyes. He stood, wrapped an arm around the man, and Thor pressed himself against Eduardo's side like a living pillar. The car was only 10 meters away. But for a dying man and an exhausted child, it might as well have been miles. Eduardo trembled with each step. Lucas was soaked in sweat, his face pale. And Thor, a silent angel, never left their side. Finally, they reached the vehicle. Eduardo collapsed into the driver's seat while Lucas scrambled to find the medicine box he'd mentioned. Eduardo swallowed 2 pills with the last drops of water in his thermos. "You saved my life," Eduardo whispered. "But why? Why did you help me? You need saving too." Lucas met his eyes, dark, intense. "Because I thought I was going to die too. And I know what that feels like. No one deserves to die alone." Silence. The kind that echoes between two beating hearts. Eduardo stared at the boy, at the red rashes on his skin, the painful way he bent his joints. He was stunned. "You have this disease too?" Lucas nodded. "Since I was little. No one knows what it is. Doctors can't help. Only Mom. And Thor." Eduardo looked like he'd been struck by lightning. For 30 years, he believed he was the only one with this strange, nameless, incurable condition. And now, in the most forsaken corner of the world, a child had it too. "No way," he whispered to himself. Lucas smiled through the pain. "Maybe God brought us to the same place, so we wouldn't have to hurt alone anymore." Eduardo was speechless. A powerful, wealthy man, owner of one of the nation's biggest pharmaceutical companies, being taught a lesson in empathy and faith by a child. After resting, Eduardo checked the car. Just as he feared, the battery was dead. "I can't drive anywhere." Lucas blinked. "So, what now?" Eduardo looked out across the sand. "There's one way," he said. "If it's a manual transmission, we could push start it. Get the wheels turning fast enough, then shift into gear." He paused, grimacing. "But I can't do it alone." Lucas said nothing. He just looked at Thor. And then, an idea sparked. "I'll drive," Lucas said. Eduardo's eyes widened. "You're 6. I don't know how to drive. But I can hold the wheel. You hit the gas. And Thor can push." Madness. An impossible plan. But in the desert, with no options, even madness can become a miracle. Eduardo nodded. Let's try. Better than waiting to die. Thor understood. When Eduardo got behind the car, Thor was already there, hind legs digging into the sand, front paws braced against the bumper. Lucas climbed into the driver's seat, hands trembling on the steering wheel, like he was gripping fate itself. Now! Eduardo shouted. Thor growled. The Jeep began to move. Second gear. Let the clutch go. Step on it. Lucas did exactly what he was told. The engine sputtered, then roared. The desert echoed with the sound of survival. Yes. Eduardo cheered, like a child. Lucas exhaled. Thor leapt into the car, panting, tongue out, eyes gleaming. They didn't know where they were going. But they knew, they had just earned a chance to live, through courage, through the bond between a boy and his dog. And through something invisible but stronger than any machine, human kindness. Have you ever driven a car through the desert, not knowing if life or death awaits at the end? Lucas, a 6-year-old boy who had never even driven a toy car, was now gripping the steering wheel of a battered old Jeep, surrounded by scorching sands. Beside him, a man fading from illness. Behind him, a dog exhausted from saving them both. The Jeep began to move, wobbling but persistent. Eduardo, barely able to lift his arms, operated the clutch and gas pedals with his feet, while Lucas, with tiny hands and a will of steel, fought to keep the steering wheel steady over the uneven terrain. You're doing great, Eduardo muttered, voice thick with emotion. Lucas didn't respond. He was too focused. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His lips were pressed tight. Each jolt of the Jeep lifted him off the seat, but he held the wheel like a soldier gripping a rifle in battle. At that moment, his eyes were no longer those of a child, but of a warrior trying to survive a war. In the back seat, Thor lay sprawled out, tongue lolling, panting hard, but his eyes stayed sharp, fixed on Lucas like a silent guardian. Turn left a little, avoid that rock, Eduardo whispered, guiding him with words. Lucas obeyed, adjusting the wheel. The engine groaned as they climbed another dune. Every meter forward was a struggle. There was no map. No GPS. Just one guide, the setting sun. Eduardo knew if they kept heading west, their odds of finding a road or village would increase. We'll follow the sunset, he said, more to himself than anyone. Night began to fall. The sun's sting softened, but the wind turned cold. Eduardo started to shiver. The medicine had eased his symptoms, but he was still dehydrated, exhausted, and mentally fraying. Lucas still clung to the wheel. You okay? Eduardo asked. I don't know, Lucas replied softly. I'm afraid I'll fall asleep. Eduardo gave a sad smile. You can't sleep, Lucas. If you sleep, we may never wake up again. Suddenly, a faint light appeared on the horizon. Not stars. Not a mirage. It was artificial, man-made light. Lucas, look. Eduardo sat up, eyes wide. Lights. Lucas blinked. Yes. Maybe, a village. People. In that moment, something stirred in Lucas, something he had almost lost during these endless days. Hope. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, leaning forward, eyes locked on the distant glow. The Jeep crawled forward. Each bump made Eduardo grit his teeth in pain, but he didn't complain. Lucas didn't speak either. They had passed the stage of weakness, they were now running on survival instinct. Closer. And closer still. Silhouettes of humble houses emerged. Not a city. Not a resort. Just a small village with a few dozen rooftops, a wooden church, and a tiny clinic, a single note of melody in the vast silence of the desert. By the time they reached the village square, the jeep was almost out of gas. Eduardo was gasping. Lucas let go of the steering wheel, his arms falling limp, like a child who had just finished the hardest test of his life. People rushed out, staring at the dusty jeep as if it had landed from another planet. An elderly woman ran up. "Where did you come from? You look like you just crawled out of hell." Eduardo didn't have the strength to answer. He only managed one sentence. "Save this child." Then collapsed. Lucas cried out. Thor howled. And darkness returned. Eduardo woke on a simple bed, wooden ceiling above, the scent of herbs and medicine in the air, and the slow hum of a ceiling fan overhead. Someone was gently wiping his face, a kind-faced middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair. "You're awake. Thank heavens. We thought we'd lost you." Eduardo gasped. "The boy. Lucas, where is he?" "In the room next door, resting. He didn't leave your side for 3 days. And your dog, oh my God, I've never seen such loyalty. It keeps going back and forth between your room and his, as if guarding both of you." Eduardo closed his eyes. The memories rushed back like a flood. The barking. The pain. The burning sand. And those dark, shining eyes of Lucas, staring back at death. He couldn't understand how, out of billions of people, he ended up meeting a boy with the same illness. Why had fate chosen Lucas? Why would a child so small be the one to save a man like him? And then, he smiled. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe it was destiny. In a tiny village called Santa Clara del Desierto, hidden deep in the endless dunes, something unbelievable had happened. An abandoned child and a dying man had driven a nearly empty jeep across the desert and found this place, as if fate had drawn a line in the sand and said, "Here." No one could believe it. They called it the miracle of the sandstorm. 3 days after being rescued, Eduardo asked to see the boy who had shared death and life with him. When the door opened, Lucas entered, thin, frail, but eyes still glowing like fire. Thor followed closely behind, tail swaying, eyes cautious but alert. "You're awake." Lucas beamed. Eduardo smiled weakly and nodded. "You didn't leave for 3 days." Lucas sat down beside the bed, his voice barely a whisper. "I was afraid, if you died, then everything I tried to do would be for nothing." Eduardo gently held the boy's hand. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Two souls, from entirely different worlds, were bound by something invisible. Survival, trust, and a strange, unspoken love. Not long after, the villagers brought Eduardo and Lucas to the village's only clinic, where the region's oldest doctor, Dr. Oliveira, had been working for 30 years without ever leaving the village once. He was a quiet man. But the moment he saw the matching rashes on both their bodies, his brow furrowed. "You say you've had these your entire life?" he asked Lucas. "Yes. And sometimes I get a high fever, terrible joint pain. No one knows what it is. My mom just helps me cope with it." Eduardo nodded, his voice hoarse. "I'm the same. For 30 years, I never met anyone else with these symptoms. I've spent tens of millions trying to find a cure, and failed." Dr. Oliveira frowned deeper and looked at Lucas. "There's something special about this boy?" "Special?" Eduardo asked. "I'll need blood samples from both of you. We don't have modern equipment here, but we can run some basic tests." When the blood was placed under the microscope, Dr. Oliveira suddenly shot up from his chair. "This can't be." Eduardo tensed. "What is it?" "The boy's blood contains a natural antibody I've never seen before. It's actively suppressing the severe inflammation response, something your body is completely missing." Lucas blinked. "I have something in my blood." "Not just something," the doctor said gravely. "It's a built-in defense system, as if this child was born to resist the very disease that's plagued you your whole life." Eduardo was stunned. 30 years. Hundreds of researchers. The most prestigious labs on Earth. And the answer to his illness was flowing in the blood of a child abandoned in the desert. "My God," he whispered. "With your and your mother's permission," Dr. Oliveira continued, "we can study it further. This may be the foundation for developing a real treatment." Eduardo looked at Lucas, still unaware of the miracle he was, and said slowly, "Do you realize, you didn't just save me? You might save thousands more. People who've never even heard your name." Lucas pressed his lips together. "But I don't want to be a lab rat." Eduardo smiled. "I understand. No one will force you. But if you agree, we'll do everything with care, respect, and kindness. I promise." Lucas looked at Thor. The dog nodded, as if he understood. The boy turned back and said quietly, "I agree. But I want to see my mom first." Eduardo nodded. "I'll do everything I can to bring your mother here. Right away." And in his heart, something was blooming. Not just hope, but faith. That this brave-hearted boy with extraordinary blood was the miracle he'd been waiting for his entire life. Have you ever witnessed a mother find the child she thought she had lost forever? If you have, you'll understand. Sometimes people cry not from sadness, but because happiness can hurt so deeply. Mariana, Lucas's mother, hadn't slept for 3 days, ever since Carlos came home alone and said, "Lucas got lost at the mall. I couldn't find him." But a mother's intuition told her it was a lie. Carlos didn't have the eyes of a panicked father. He had the eyes of someone hiding a crime. And that very intuition saved Lucas's life. She reported to the police. She pressed Carlos with questions. Eventually, everything unraveled. He confessed, with a cold, indifferent voice. "That boy was a burden. I just gave you your life back." He was arrested immediately. But Lucas was gone. No one knew where he was. No one. Until the phone rang. An elderly voice, calm and gentle. "My name is Rosa. I live in the village of Santa Clara del Desierto. Your son, Lucas, is here. He's alive." Mariana collapsed, her entire body trembling like her nerves had snapped. She cried like never before, choking out only one sentence. "My son, he's really alive." 2 days later, a rescue helicopter landed in an open patch near the village. The townspeople had never seen anything so large or loud. They gathered, wide-eyed and whispering. Mariana was the first to step off. She didn't wait for anyone. She didn't care about her luggage. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and stopped when she saw a small figure holding the hand of a silver-haired man, and a large dog sitting loyally beside them. "Lucas!" Her scream split the desert sky. Lucas turned. For a second, He stood frozen, as if afraid to believe his eyes. Then his tiny legs sprinted forward. Mother and son embraced tightly in the sweltering desert heat. I thought I'd never see you again, Lucas sobbed. No, my son. I will never leave you. I would cross the whole world to find you. Thor let out a long, emotional howl, as if adding his voice to this sacred reunion. Everyone stood in silence, eyes misty. Even Rosa, who had witnessed countless life and death moments, turned away to hide her tears. Eduardo stood back, not stepping forward. He knew this was their moment. But Lucas, after wiping his tears, turned and called out, "Mom, this is Mr. Eduardo. He helped me survive. And I helped save him too." Mariana approached, eyes still filled with confusion and awe. "You were with my son this whole time?" Eduardo nodded. "No. Your son saved me," he said softly. "If it weren't for that boy, I would have died in the desert. I owe him my life and my faith." Mariana couldn't speak. Then she noticed the red rashes on Eduardo's arm. Her eyes widened. "You have the same illness. We're the same. But maybe, because of that, this boy may hold in his blood what I've searched for my whole life, a chance to heal." Dr. Oliveira stepped out of the clinic, handing Mariana a folder of preliminary test results and gently explaining their meaning. Mariana listened. Her stunned expression slowly shifted into something radiant: hope. "And you want to take my son away for research?" Her voice wavered, cautious. Eduardo nodded, without hesitation. "I'm not asking to take him. I'm inviting you both to come with us. You will oversee every test. No pain. No force. I swear, on the honor of a man who once lost his faith, and found it again because of your son." Mariana looked down at Lucas, now petting Thor. She saw it clearly. Her son had changed. He was no longer the fragile boy who clung only to his mother. He had walked the line between life and death. And carried back something no one expected: the power to save others. She took a deep breath. "All right. Let's try." Eduardo couldn't hide his emotion. And within him, even more powerful than the medical discovery, was something new. A sense of family. Have you ever believed that a survival story could become a mission to save thousands? Lucas, a 6-year-old boy, never thought of it that way. He only knew that he was alive. That his mother was holding him again. That Thor still wagged his tail like always. To him, that was enough. But to the adults, this was just the beginning. 3 days after leaving Santa Clara del Desierto, Lucas, his mother, and Eduardo arrived via a private flight at the headquarters of Mendez Pharmaceuticals, one of the country's largest pharmaceutical corporations. The towering building stood like a monument to science and ambition. But strangely, when Lucas entered, every employee stopped and bowed their heads. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Eduardo, founder of the company, a man who had spent his life chasing a cure for a nameless illness, now walked slowly, hand in hand with a small boy, taking uncertain steps into a future neither could have imagined. "This isn't just a lab," Eduardo whispered to Lucas. "It's where medical dreams are born." Lucas looked around, overwhelmed by the sleek machines, scientists in white coats gliding through halls like rivers of knowledge. He felt small. But when he looked up and saw Eduardo smiling, still holding his hand, he felt strangely safe. "You won't be alone," Eduardo said gently. "Everything we do here is for children like you." so that one day, no one will have to suffer like you did. Lucas was placed in a private, child-friendly medical suite, clean, quiet, and welcoming. All he had to do was provide regular blood samples. No painful needles. No scary tubes. Every process was designed so he never felt like a lab rat. Mariana was always by his side. She signed the permission papers under one condition. Lucas could stop whenever he wanted. Eduardo agreed instantly. No arguments. Thor, now a beloved fixture, even had a small bed in Lucas's room, marked with a golden plaque. Desert Hero. The research began. From Lucas's blood cells, scientists discovered a never-before-documented natural antibody. It didn't destroy the illness. It communicated with it. It calmed the body's immune response, allowing it to adapt and balance itself. A sort of biological peacekeeper. When Eduardo read the first report, tears filled his eyes. "This is the breakthrough I've waited for my entire life," he said. "Lucas, you've brought light to people living in darkness." The project was named Lucasin, in honor of the boy who inspired a medical revolution. Soon, the media caught wind of the unbelievable tale. A boy abandoned in the desert, who saved a dying billionaire, who then unknowingly became the key to curing a rare, nameless disease. TV channels, newspapers, medical journals, all wanted interviews. But Lucas, ever humble and shy, always said the same thing. "I'm not a hero. I just did the right thing." That simple line became the official motto of Mendez Pharmaceuticals. A giant sign with those words now hangs in the company's main lobby, beneath an oil painting of Lucas and Thor, standing in a sandstorm, holding a lantern, guiding the world of medicine toward the light. 1 month later, the first clinical trial results came back, astonishing success. The experimental drug Lucasin reduced severe symptoms by up to 95%. With no major side effects, no physical exhaustion. Eduardo immediately called for a national press conference. In a packed hall filled with scientists, medical leaders, and journalists, he stepped up to the podium. With Lucas and his mother sitting in the front row, he spoke with a voice deep and full of emotion. "Today, we're not just announcing a new drug. We're sharing a story of faith, of a child's courage, and of how miracles can grow from the deepest despair." Then he turned to Lucas. "You're not a test subject. You are the light in the darkness. You didn't just save me. You gave thousands of others a second chance at life." The room erupted in applause. But amid the flashing cameras, Lucas only lowered his head, patted Thor, and whispered, "We did it, didn't we?" Thor didn't answer, but his eyes sparkled, as if he, too, was smiling. Have you ever imagined that a boy once left to die in the desert would one day become the inspiration behind a global movement for compassionate medicine? If not, look to Lucas, the child the entire country now lovingly calls the Angel of the White Sands. What started as a medical study, Lucasin soon became a symbol. Eduardo didn't just want to develop a drug. He wanted to build a foundation, a vision, where children born with rare diseases were no longer seen as burdens. 1 month after the press conference, Eduardo hosted a special event. The inauguration of the Lucas Santos Mendez Research Institute, a state-of-the-art center dedicated to treating and supporting children with rare diseases from across the globe. At the ceremony, he stood beside Lucas and his mother, introducing the institute to hundreds of international guests, top physicians, and, most importantly, families who had once lost hope because no hospital would accept their child. "This is not just a scientific facility," Eduardo declared. "This is where hope takes root. Every child forgotten by medicine, by society, will walk through these doors as a complete human being." Then he turned to Lucas, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you know what the most miraculous thing is, Lucas? Not the medicine. Not the building. But your heart, choosing to save someone instead of holding on to water. That single decision changed the world." The entire hall fell silent. Lucas said nothing. He quietly stepped to the center of the stage, holding the microphone with trembling hands, then looked up. "I'm just a kid who's been in pain for years. I know what it feels like to be called useless. I know the looks of pity. The exhaustion in my mom's face when she stayed up all night with me, too tired to even cry. I used to think no one would ever need me." The room held its breath. But Thor never left me. And when I saw Mr. Eduardo lying alone out there, I knew, if I didn't help him, I'd be someone who abandoned, too. He turned toward his mother, Mariana, sobbing silently. "If I can help just one person not feel the pain I felt, I'll do it. Not because I'm a hero, but because I know what it's like to hurt alone." No one in that hall remained unmoved. Even Eduardo, a man who had weathered so many storms in life, bowed his head and quietly wiped his tears. A few days later, the institute opened its doors. Children from all over, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, even Japan, and France, began arriving. Dr. Oliveira was invited to serve as honorary advisor, given his own office and authority to recommend clinical trials. Lucas became an honorary resident of the institute. He no longer had to undergo daily testing, but he often stopped by the research lab asking, "Did you find anything new today?" Thor became the institute's mascot, wearing a gold name tag that read, "The loyal friend of brave hearts." Each day, he roamed the halls, visiting patient rooms and treatment areas like a silent nurse. Every child wanted to hug Thor, to nap with him, to look into his gentle, loyal eyes. One evening, as a red sun dipped behind the mountains, Lucas sat with Eduardo on the institute's rooftop. After a long silence, he asked, "Mr. Eduardo, if I hadn't given you water that day, what do you think would have happened?" Eduardo looked into the distance, then turned back with a sad but warm smile. "I would have died. But not just that. I think the last good part of me might have died too." Lucas looked puzzled. "You know," Eduardo continued, "before I met you, I thought my illness was a curse. Proof that God had given up on me. But now, I understand it was a path. A hard road, yes. But if you're brave enough to keep going, someone will be waiting at the end." Lucas smiled faintly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flower. A desert blossom he had found near the abandoned jeep. Still intact, pressed in a notebook. "I've kept it since that day," he said. "I don't know how it bloomed in such a dry place." Eduardo stared at it for a long time, then said softly, "Because some seeds only bloom when nothing else survives. They exist to prove that even in death, life can begin." Lucas nodded. And in that moment, beneath a blood-red sunset and the whisper of desert wind, two people who had once met at the edge of despair understood. They hadn't just survived. They had lived with meaning. Some children are born carrying what seems like a curse, but they live as miracles. Lucas was one of them. not because of the rare blood in his veins, but because he used his pain to heal others. 6 months after the institute began operations, the research based on Lucas's antibodies led to a breakthrough no one had dared dream of. A complete, safe treatment plan with 100% effectiveness in clinical trials. The scientific community called it the Lucasin miracle. The media called it an everyday wonder. But to the parents who had watched their children fade with no hope, it was a doorway to life. Letters of gratitude poured into the institute. Whispers of thank you, Lucas echoed from children's hospitals around the world. Kids who once couldn't walk now ran freely through schoolyards. And at the center of it all, the boy who once knelt in burning sand now sat quietly reading under a tree in the institute garden, with Thor curled up beside him. On a cold late winter evening, as winds blew down from the northern mountains, Mariana stood by the institute window, eyes distant. Eduardo approached, an envelope in hand. "From the court," he said evenly. "Carlos has been sentenced to 15 years, attempted murder of a minor and obstruction of kin." Mariana said nothing. She didn't cry. She simply nodded. In her eyes, there was no hatred, only the calm relief of a mother who had pulled her child back from the edge. "I don't want to speak his name again," she said. "Because Lucas deserves a new beginning." Eduardo smiled. "And so do you." The next day, Eduardo led Lucas to a special room. A surprise he had spent 3 months preparing. When the door opened, Lucas froze. Before him stood a miniature library. Hundreds of children's books in every language. On the wall hung a painting of him, Thor, and other children walking hand in hand through the desert, toward the light. "I know you love books," Eduardo said. "And I believe stories can heal in ways medicine never could." Lucas stepped in, gently touching a book spine like it was something sacred. "I'll read them all," he whispered, eyes glowing. "And someday," Eduardo added, "maybe you'll write stories for other children, too." Lucas turned, surprised. "Can I really do that?" Eduardo smiled. "You already wrote the biggest story of my life. With your own." At the end of the month, the institute hosted a special event. The Day of the Survivors. Hundreds of former patients attended. Some flew in from faraway countries just to meet the boy who had inspired their will to live. Lucas was invited on stage. But instead of giving a speech, he simply said, "I don't know how to create miracles. But I know how to listen. And I want all of you to know. We are never a burden." That quote appeared on every front page the next morning. One night, under the bougainvillea vines behind the institute, Mariana and Eduardo sat together. Moonlight cast soft shadows on the tiled courtyard. Thor lay quietly at their feet, a silent guardian of memory. "Did you ever think," Mariana asked, "that the desert would lead us here?" Eduardo paused, then answered, "I used to think the desert was a place of death. But because of you and Lucas, I know now, it can also be where everything begins." They sat in silence. "Lucas asked me," Mariana whispered, eyes on the moon, "if Mr. Eduardo would always stay with us." Eduardo turned, looked her in the eyes. "I've spent my whole life searching for a family. Now I know, I've found it." Mariana said nothing. She simply took his hand. And beneath the rustling trees, no one heard the soft whisper from a boy at his window. "Mom, I'll grow up to help kids like me. I promise." Thor let out a quiet whine, as if affirming the vow. Lucas turned, hugged his dog's neck, and under the gentle moonlight, the boy who was once abandoned, was preparing to become a guide. A light for others. If you've ever been a child forgotten by adults, you'll understand why Lucas could never live an ordinary life. Not because of his rare disease. Not because he was the miracle child. But because inside him, from a very young age, a seed had been planted. A seed of responsibility and compassion. 1 year after the desert incident, Lucas turned 7. The illness that once tormented him nightly was now tamed, controlled by the very drug that bore his name. But Lucas didn't stop there. His small heart began to dream big dreams, dreams for the children who had no one else to dream for them. One early spring morning, Lucas asked to meet Eduardo privately. Inside the top-floor office of the Mendez Institute, sunlight pouring through glass windows, Eduardo was surprised to see Lucas carrying a notebook covered in drawings and scribbled notes. "I want to start a group," Lucas said, eyes shining. "A group for kids like me. Survivors." Eduardo smiled. "Go on. I'm calling it the Sand Kids. Each week, we'll write letters to kids still in treatment. We'll send books, draw pictures, and host online meetups for those who live far away. I want them to know, they're not alone." Eduardo looked at him. A year ago, this boy had been abandoned in the desert. Now, he was thinking of an entire invisible generation. Children with illnesses, overlooked by society, seen with pity instead of empathy. "That's a wonderful idea," Eduardo said. "And I'll help you make it real." Within 2 months, the Sand Kids launched with over 200 members from 12 countries. The group's website featured a logo. A boy and a dog standing in the desert, holding up a glowing lantern. Inspired by Lucas and Thor. Each week, Lucas and his team wrote dozens of letters to children around the world. "Hi. I'm Diego, 8 years old. I was in the hospital for 3 months. But after reading Lucas's letter, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Hi there. I'm Hannah, from Japan. I'm getting discharged soon thanks to Lucasin. I'm learning Spanish so I can meet Lucas one day and thank him in person." These letters pulsed like fresh lifeblood through weak hearts. And Lucas, still a child himself, became the bridge for those who once had none. In a national TV interview, a reporter asked, "Do you dream of becoming a doctor someday?" Lucas thought, then shook his head. "No, I want to be a storyteller. Because doctors heal bodies. But stories heal hearts." The studio fell silent. The host wiped a tear before continuing. At the 1-year anniversary of the Lucas Santos Mendez Institute, hundreds who had been saved by Lucasin gathered to celebrate. On stage, Eduardo, now healthier than ever, unveiled a new initiative. "Today, I'm proud to announce Lucas School, a school for children with rare diseases. A place where they can receive treatment, learn, and grow, just like every other child." Mariana wept in the audience. Lucas, standing backstage with Thor, looked on with a calm gaze, as soft as a late-day breeze. He knew. Every step he took, every small act, was planting seeds of hope in the driest places. Because he had once been a seed in the desert. That night, Lucas sat on the rooftop with his mother, Eduardo, and Thor. 4 souls, not connected by blood, but bound as a family. Eduardo placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Lucas, do you know something? I once thought life was a sentence. But because of you, I now know, it's a poem." Lucas looked up and replied, "You taught me to live. Mom taught me to love. Thor taught me loyalty. Now it's my turn, to teach others to believe. The night sky glittered with stars. Thor rested his head on Lucas's lap. And through the rustle of leaves in the wind, something, perhaps fate, perhaps eternal faith, whispered. That boy is the answer to the world's prayers. You might never forget the moment you looked up and saw the first star of the night. Not because it was the brightest, but because it was the first. The one that signaled darkness was fading, and light was returning. Lucas was no longer a lonely star in the desert. He had become the first light for countless lost hearts. December arrived. Winter winds, early nights. The Lucas Mendez Institute sparkled with lights for the end-of-year celebration. Not just Christmas. Not just New Year's. But the second anniversary of a fateful day in the desert. Lucas was now 8. Still the same small boy, but his eyes held depths that even adults hesitated to confront. On the anniversary night, in a hall aglow with candlelight and music, hundreds gathered, patients, doctors, parents, donors from all over the world. And everyone fell silent as Lucas stepped onto the stage, holding a paper lantern. No microphone. No spotlight. Only the gentle light of many small flames. He spoke. 2 years ago, I was left in the desert. No one knew who I was. No one believed I'd survive. But I did, not because I was strong, but because someone never left me. He knelt, petting Thor, still loyal, now older, but with eyes just as sharp. I don't want to retell a sad story. I want to speak of good things. Because if not for that desert, I wouldn't have found the people I love most. Mom. Mr. Eduardo. Everyone here. And even those who've never met me, but are alive today because of Lucasin. Silence filled the room. Lucas continued. Now I know. Each of us is like a grain of sand. Small. Fragile. But if we hold together, we can become a desert that shines under the sun. The entire hall erupted in applause. The next morning, Eduardo, Mariana, and Lucas strolled through the expanded Institute campus, now 3 times larger, offering care in Spanish, English, and Japanese. Don't want a birthday party? Eduardo asked, hands in his coat pockets. Lucas shrugged. This year, I just want to be with everyone. No cake. No presents. Just to see the kids healthy. Mariana smiled and tousled his hair. You've always been like that. Eduardo gently added. You never answered me. Besides writing books, what else would you like to do someday? Lucas thought for a long moment. Then. I want to build another institute. In the desert, where I was left. So no one else ever dies there again. To turn the most hopeless place into a beginning for new hope. Both Eduardo and Mariana stopped walking. In the crisp early winter wind, their eyes glistened. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Lucas sat by his window. Golden light bathed his hair. Thor slept peacefully at his feet. One hand stroked his dog's back. The other held a small notebook, his very first journal. The day I was born again from sand. The day a stranger became my father. The day I realized I don't need to be the best. I just need to never give up. Outside, the first star blinked into view. Lucas smiled, closed the notebook, and whispered. I'm ready to keep writing. Not just my story, but the story of everyone who thought they were forgotten. And like a promise, echoing through the deserts of life, there would always be a Lucas. A boy carrying the first light. Small, but enough, to warm the world. Do you still remember Lucas? The boy once abandoned in the desert, with just a bottle of water and a small bag of food. Standing in the middle of nowhere, unsure how long he would survive. Today, Lucas is 10. No longer just the miracle child. He has become part of a great destiny. A voice for an entire generation. Nearly 3 years after his life and death journey through the sand, the Lucas Mendez Research Institute had expanded to 5 countries. The Sand Kids program now operated in over 40 nations, with more than 10,000 members, all children who had battled or were still fighting life-threatening diseases. Every month, Lucas received hundreds of letters. Some written in the wobbly handwriting of a 6-year-old. Some, final farewells from children who didn't make it. Lucas kept them all. Not a single letter was lost. He said, "Every word is a fragment of life. Even if they only lived for a week, a day, they existed. And no one is ever forgotten." One autumn day, Lucas was invited to speak at the United Nations, becoming the youngest spokesperson in history to address the rights of children with rare diseases. In the solemn assembly hall, he stood in a neat little suit, though his familiar tousled brown hair remained. Stepped up to the microphone and opened with a question that stunned the world. If a child like me, abandoned by a stepfather to die, can survive, save others, and still love, then why can't we, as grown ups, do the same for other children? No one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because they were too moved. Lucas didn't use slogans. He told the truth. His voice was calm, never dramatic. But each sentence cut deep, quietly slicing into the conscience of the world. Some kids die because there's no medicine. Some children are abandoned because of their illness. Some mothers cry all night because they can't afford fever medicine. We live in a world where medicine exists, but compassion is in short supply. He ended with one line. I can't save the world, but because I was once saved, I will live to save others. Then he bowed. The entire hall rose. A standing ovation. Some wept. Some stood in silence. But from that day on, governments and non-profits around the globe began re-evaluating their care systems for children with rare diseases. And all of it began with the voice of a child born into pain. When Lucas returned from New York, he was welcomed as a national hero. But he lived simply. Still read in his tiny library. Still walked with Thor, now old, his eyesight fading, through the institute gardens every evening. One dusk, with the sky ablaze like spilled fire, Lucas sat beside Thor, gently stroking his ears and whispered, "Are you tired, Thor? I know, you've come a long way with me. But if you are, I promise I'll continue on my own." Thor didn't answer. He only sighed and rested his head on Lucas's lap, as if to say, "We walk together. Slowly, maybe, but no one gets left behind." That winter, Thor passed away. Peacefully. In his sleep. No cries. No pain. Just one morning, Lucas woke up, and his companion was gone. No one disturbed him. Eduardo and Mariana left him alone with Thor for the whole morning. Lucas didn't cry. He simply opened his first notebook, the one with his desert journey, and wrote, "You brought me out of the darkness. Now it's my turn, to light the way for others." That day, the institute held a quiet funeral in the garden. A small headstone marked the spot where sunlight and flowers always reached. It read, Thor. Friend, guide, hero. Sometimes, angels have 4 legs. At age 12, a documentary crew from the UK visited to film Lucas's life. They asked, if you could go back to that day, the day you were left in the desert, would you change anything? Lucas thought for a very long time. Then replied, no. Because the moment I was abandoned was the moment I was given a choice to become who I wanted to be. And I chose not to be a victim. I chose to be a beginning. Dear friend, this story comes to a close here. But if you've ever felt lost in your own desert, please remember, even in weakness, you can save someone. Even as a grain of sand, you can touch the ocean. Even if you're just a small light, you may be the first star someone ever sees. Lucas, once forgotten, became a light for the world. And you? Whose light will you become? Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how it might shape the way you live. Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story moved your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue creating stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.